You're listening to Policy Room by SPRF.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Policy Room. At the wake of the pandemic, Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the Indian Chamber of Commerce, where he first spoke about Atmanirbhar Bharat, which will make the country self-reliant. While the government has been stressing on Swadeshi and Make in India for some time now, it hasn't been particularly successful in its implementation. The COVID 19 pandemic, however, has had an unprecedented impact on the economy, demanding an immediate reconsideration of the existing neoliberal models of growth, and also reinstating the need for the government to put immediate emphasis on truly becoming more vocal for local and also ensuring self reliance at the grassroots level. Given this context, today we will be examining the significance of localization in the present scenario where the country is plagued with economic and ecological crisis. I'm Sumeha, a research assistant at the Social and Political Research Foundation, and today with us we have Mr. Ashish Kothari. Mr. Kothari is a founder member of Pune-based NGO Kalpavriksh. He has coordinated India's national biodiversity strategy and has also been on multiple government committees, including the National Wildlife Action Plan and Biodiversity Action Plan. Having been part of many people's movements, including the Narmada Bachao Andolan, he now helps coordinate the Vikalp Sangam to network development alternatives in India. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you.
So, to start off with today's discussion, could you define the term localization for our listeners and then also maybe delve into how it has been adopted across geographies?
Sure. There are two very important aspects of localization, and especially in contrast to the kind of globalization that we've had in the last few decades. One is the economic, which is where what we're trying to argue is that people need to have self-reliance, at least for basic needs, things like food and water and energy and housing and health and education and so on, rather than be dependent on global forces, whether they are governmental or corporate, which is unfortunately what globalization has done, made us dependent on very long distance exchanges, very long distance services and goods. And as we've seen in the COVID period, when something like this is no longer possible, then local economies also suffer. People don't have enough food, or they don't have enough water or energy or other basic needs. So one is the economic self-reliance at the local level. Local doesn't necessarily mean every single village. It could be a cluster of 20, 30 villages. It could be 10, 15 villages with a small town, etc. So, but it is geographically localized. The second crucial part of localization is the power of decision making. Now, we have a form of democracy, not just in India, but most parts of the world, where we go to elections once in 5 years or 4 years, and then we hope that the government that is elected into power will do the right things for us. Now, as we know, this doesn't necessarily happen. Whereas in many parts of the world, including in some parts of India, people are saying that where we are the government, at least as far as decisions that are important for our lives, whether they're to do with our own local governance or with our local nature and natural resources or our society, that we should be the ones at the center of decision making, which is really the true spirit of the 73rd and 74th Amendments to the Indian Constitution, which were about bodies of self-governance, but unfortunately have not really been properly implemented. So localization is both political and economic. It needs to go hand in hand with other things, which I'll speak about maybe a little later.
Right. Thank you for explaining that. But then, how significant do you think that this concept of localization is in the current context where we have seen that the pandemic has exposed some of the most gaping issues in the neoliberal strategies that were adopted by the state? And do you also think that, in a way, the pandemic has perhaps provided momentum to the process of localization in India?
Well, it has certainly exposed as you're saying, exposed the hollowness of the policies of both nationalization and globalization. See, where people were dependent on long distance livelihoods and jobs, we've seen, for instance, what happened with migrant labor and casual labor. And during the first wave of the pandemic and leading up to the second wave, probably something like 25 to 30 million Indians were rendered poorer than they were earlier because of all these issues. On the other hand, we have documented as part of the Vikalp Sangam process helped by Kalpavriksh, we've documented several dozen stories of where communities were resilient to the COVID crisis in terms of food, health, livelihoods, etc., because they had sustained or revived or created new forms of localized economy and decision making. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. Something like 70 to 75 villages in Telangana, where the Dalit women farmers movement called the Deccan Development Society has been active. They not only had no case of COVID in the first wave, but were completely food self-sufficient because they had switched 25 years back to their own local seeds, their own local water, their own local knowledge, and local exchanges, grain banks, etc., etc., in these villages. So there was nobody going hungry. In fact, they were providing food relief to the district administration. Another example is from Northeast Network, again a women's network which has been able to sustain the traditional rice cropping and shifting cultivation patterns in parts of Nagaland, and they too did not suffer any serious crisis with regard to these sorts of basic needs. So the clear lessons to this is that in these kind of crises, and mind you, these kind of crises will come time and again, especially with more viruses, with climate, with financial collapses, etc. The only way communities are able to sustain is if they are resilient with regard to their own local ecosystems, local production patterns, local exchanges, consumer producer relations, which are more or less in a localized area. Now, this is the clear lesson the government should have picked up and started supporting in the recovery package, the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat package. They should have been supporting these kind of initiatives, this kind of localization, and also very clear community control over local natural ecosystems. This is another big lesson. So, for instance, where in central India, such as in Gadchiroli district of Maharashtra, Adivasis have been able to claim community forest rights under the Forest Rights Act over their surrounding forests, they were able to sustain themselves during the COVID period much better than where the forests are still in the control of the government, the forest department. And so another clear lesson is provide full rights to the local communities over their commons, over their common resources. So it could be forests, it could be water, rivers, lakes, coastal areas, mountain areas, whatever. Wherever people are dependent for their livelihoods, those commons need to be in the control of the local communities, the gram sabhas, or the even in cities, the urban wards is what is another very clear lesson from the COVID pandemic.
Right. So, I mean, since you mentioned the Northeast network, I think it's sort of important to bring up how, so the practice of shifting cultivation in general has been a very, like, it's been in place for years, for centuries now. And the basic tenets of the practice involve common sharing of land, usage of traditional seeds and seeds from previous harvests. So in general, it's a very like sustainable practice, and it's also sustainable for the region's geography. However, we see that the policies that are in place sort of erode the practice and make it very unsustainable, because the Indian government has been pushing for monoculture in the region. It has been pushing for oil palm plantations and also standing agriculture. So then we see that there's this massive contradiction, right? The people have these initiatives in place which help them support themselves, but the government, the policies in place sort of erode. So that sort of drives me to my next question, that what strategies do you think that the state must adopt to create an enabling policy environment for these sort of alternatives that you mentioned, for these alternatives to flourish?
Yeah, I think one thing that we have to realize is that attack on practices such as shifting cultivation or June, and also things like nomadic pastoralism, which is the other one that has been severely disprivileged, is both a cultural attack and an economic attack. Cultural because during colonial times, the British came in with the view that these sorts of practices are primitive, unsustainable, outmoded, and they need to be replaced with settled agriculture or settled pastoralism or industry or whatever. And this, unfortunately, even after independence, is something that it's an attitude that the government of India also sustained. The Forest Department, for instance, always argued that shifting cultivation was destructive to the environment, whereas, as you have very rightly said, it was a resilient and sustainable response to fragile ecosystems. Now, it is also true that in some areas, because of various factors, shifting cultivation or nomadic pastoralism has become somewhat unsustainable. But that is also because of the kind of policies of restricting their movement, policies of deliberate settling, etc., that has caused this. So you're also right that one of the other policy directions taken by the government has been extremely destructive, which is monocultures, both of crops and of livestock, the introduction of hybrids, the introduction of crossbreeds, and so on. Now, the kind of enabling policy we would need to sustain, firstly, to revive the sustainability of jhum and pastoralism and traditional farming practices and so on, and secondly, to bring them back where they have been abandoned, lost, and have been replaced by commercialized monocultures. The enabling policies would involve 3 or 4 things. One, I've already mentioned to you, community control over the commons. They could be forest commons, agricultural commons, water commons, and knowledge commons also. Second, instead of enormous subsidies to monocultures and chemical fertilizers and so on, there needs to be a government support to organic and to biologically diverse forms of cultivation and pastoralism and traditional livelihoods, and linking them to non-agricultural livelihoods such as crafts, which is always traditionally also there was a lot of these kind of linkages, but that's been lost. So creating actually vibrant local economies that are diversified in their base, which are dependent on and sustaining the local natural ecosystems and natural resources, and which are building on the knowledge system of the local communities, to which one can add other knowledge systems, modern science and technology as relevant, but not to displace them and think of them as being primitive, etc. So these are the sorts of things that would need to go into policy shifts, but these are very big shifts. Some state governments have been better, more progressive in providing this kind of support. But in general, the central government and most state governments have not really provided this kind of an enabling policy environment. In fact, most of the policy environment is counterproductive, it is regressive, it actually encourages and forces people to move towards unsustainable patterns of production.
Right. That does make a lot of sense. So yeah. So circling back to like a conversation on the alternative initiatives that you mentioned, I just wanted to ask, what aspects of the economy do you think can and should be localized, and which aspects should be left to globalization?
Yeah. So I think what's very important, absolutely important, is that all or most basic needs need to be localized. Now, in basic needs, there are, of course, like I mentioned, there's food and water, energy, and housing and clothing, and so on. And there's really no reason why they cannot be produced in a certain localized region. Even household goods, like soaps and detergents and things that one is using in one's daily life. Recently, there was a study done by a village called Kunaria in Kutch, which did some fantastic work in being resilient with regard to livelihoods and health during the COVID pandemic. And they did a survey and they found that something like every month the village was spending 40 lakh rupees on daily household items every month. And the Sarpanch and the Panchayat there was actually telling us, saying that why should we not produce most of this stuff within a certain within the village and a certain geographical radius around us. Maybe 20 villages get together and produce the soap and the footwear and everything that we use in our houses. Why should we buy all these things from corporations which are just profit making? So this kind of this would be the first let's say mandate for localization, self-reliant with regard to basic needs. Beyond that, if you want coffee from South India, or if you want something which grows very well only in one part of India or one part of the world, that's fine. That can still be exchanged, that can still be traded, but that exchange and trade should not be at the cost of that local self-reliance. That is the most important part of this. If, for instance, we want, I don't know, kiwis from New Zealand, fine, let them come, but that should not be at the expense of local self-reliance in growing our own fruits and our own vegetables. And the other crucial thing with globalization is that the positive globalization that we've had for thousands of years is cultural exchanges, even material exchanges. Mangoes have gone from here to Brazil. Chili, which we all think of as being Indian, has come from South America to India, etc. So these are long drawn out exchanges that have taken place, cultures, languages, food cuisines, all kinds of things. That kind of globalization is fine. What the problem is, where financial and economic globalization that tends to put more and more economic power in the hands of a handful of people in government or in private corporations, and it tends to undermine the self-sufficiency and self-reliance of local communities. That is the globalization one has to fight against.
Right. So making the economies in the local communities more and more economically empowered would be the way to go, right?
Absolutely, which also means that we have to then also challenge the structures and relations of economic concentration in the hands of private corporations in capitalist societies, or in the hands of centralized governments in state-dominated or statism societies, as we call them. So that kind of concentrate. So the economic power or the control over economic production and consumption needs to be in the hands of those who are the real producers and the consumers. And very often, of course, producers and consumers are the same. So, for instance, industrial production should be in the hands of, say, worker cooperatives, and there are many examples around the world of that. Agricultural production should be in the hands of farmers, especially small farmers, and including special attention to women who do most of the work on farms in India, and so on and so forth. Crafts need to be in the hands of actual craft persons. Unfortunately, we have an economy in which the actual controls for a lot of these things lie in the hands of those who don't really work. They own the capital, or they are in government. They don't actually put in the hard work. It's put in by workers, but then they run away with the profits, and that is something that has to be challenged.
Right. So I believe there are a bunch of alternative initiatives currently in India, which are being regulated by, say, women farmers or worker cooperatives, like you mentioned. So could you maybe take us through the story of some of these initiatives and how, while working at the intersection of nature and community, they have also been combating the current crisis that is prevailing in the country?
Sure. Let me give you maybe examples from 3-4 different sectors, so we know that it's possible not just in one area and different parts of India. So I've already mentioned two to you, and let me give slight more elaboration to them. The Dalit women farmers in Telangana under the Deccan Development Society, as I said, about 75 villages, about 5,000 women. They turned from being extremely, having deprivations of various kinds, hunger, malnutrition, lack of access to schools and health facilities, etc., etc. The usual thing that Dalit families and especially Dalit women face across India. From that to kind of mobilizing themselves, forming women's sanghas in each of the villages, and then the federation, which is the DDS, Deccan Development Society, and turning back to their traditional crops, especially millets, jowar and bajra and ragi and so on, local rice varieties, local pulses, etc., and completely to organic farming, sharing seeds with women who had lost them, didn't have them anymore, creating grain banks in every village so that people had easy access to seeds to plant, linking the local foods with the public distribution system so that people had nutritious organic local food to buy in the PDS, in the parallel public distribution system, and so on and so forth. It's a very long story. I won't go on and on. But basically, through all of this, they were able to become not just food secure, which is to say enough food in their houses, but also what they call food sovereign. That is, food sovereignty means complete control over everything to do with food, no dependence on anybody outside. They have also then moved into things like community radio station, community filmmaking, and many other aspects of transforming their lives as women and as Dalits into much more people who are much more respected in their own villages. Second example I've given you is Northeast Network. It's a similar story, so I won't go into more detail there, except of course a very different cultural context in Nagaland. And different cultivation patterns and so on, but otherwise a similar story. A third example that I can give you is from Kutch, which is interesting because it's a craft-based story where handloom weaving has been a traditional craft, and then that suffered a very severe decline because of various reasons, including the fact that the Indian government has always supported mass industrial production of textiles rather than handmade and handloom, and so there was it was collapsing. Then in 2005 2006, some of the local weavers and an organization called Khamir, they got together and did some innovations based on a local organic cotton called Kala cotton, and they actually created a market of products of consumers who wanted to have organic cotton, wanted to have nicely hand woven and often even hand spun cloth. And because of that, handloom weaving has significantly revived and has brought back a number of young people, including young men who had gone off to work in the Gulf or in nearby industries, Tata, Adani, etc. They've actually come back into handloom weaving. And when we asked them, we did a 2-year-long study with them. And when we asked them why, they said, well, we are earning better, but also we are able to be in control of our own time. We are able to express our creativity, unlike what we were doing in an industrial labor job. We are sitting with our family and working. We are continuing the heritage of our own community, the Kutchi brand of cloths, etc., and so on. So it was like a very interesting mixed narrative of cultural, social, economic sort of motivations for coming into this kind of a livelihood. So that's the third example. Maybe I'll give you a very quick example from an urban area, because that's also something that is important. We do have cities. Cities are collapsing in various different ways. So again, back to Kutch. The example is from the district headquarters, Bhuj. Now, Bhuj is not a very big city. It's got about 250,000 people, and it's burgeoning, it's exploding. So there is a program called Homes in the City, run by 5 or 6 local NGOs with the municipal corporation also involved, and they have been working in the colonies of Bhuj, both the poor colonies and the richer colonies, and trying to create much more self-reliance with regard to basic needs like water and energy and housing, etc., but also create a sense of how urban citizens can be much more a central part of decision making with regard to the city's planning, the budget, etc. And trying to kind of bring, the I mentioned earlier the 74th Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which was to do with urban local self-governance, to actually try and implement that on the ground, and also look at issues like reviving lakes, bringing wildlife back into the city, etc. So a sort of a combination of economic, social, cultural, and ecological revivals, along with political empowerment.
All right. So, how can these visions, models, and practical embodiments of an alternative economic future become more widespread in a country like India? Essentially, how do we scale these up to a broader societal level?
Yeah, one of the important lessons we have learned is that India is such a diverse country in terms of ecological conditions, economic, social, political, cultural conditions, that the idea of either scaling up or replicating doesn't necessarily work. But what we advocate is what we call scaling out or outscaling, which means to learn the key processes and lessons and values and ethics of any successful initiative, and then try those out, use those to try it out in one's own context. So to do that, so which basically means thousands and thousands of initiatives across the country, and then to network them in a way that they create scale. So just to give an example, supposing there are 1,000 natural or organic or biologically diverse farming initiatives in South India, and if they all are able to network with each other, exchange, and create a group for collaboration and for advocacy, then they might also be able to change the macro policy situation, or to shift many more thousands of farmers into that kind of farming by giving them inspiration and lessons and collaborating with them. So that's what we call sort of outscaling rather than upscaling or replication. The other important thing here would be, apart from this kind of networking and collaboration and so on, is to advocate for policy shifts, like I said earlier. So, for instance, instead of tens of thousands of crores of rupees going into chemical fertilizers, if there could be a shift to supporting organic and biodiverse farming, then many more farmers would be able to shift, because especially with small farmers, it's not so easy for them to shift. If they've already taken to chemical based agriculture, it's not so easy for them to shift quickly, because there is a loss of production initially and things like that. So a little bit of subsidy or a little bit of support at that stage would help a lot. And maybe 4, 5, 6 years, they could also then become self-reliant and not need the subsidy anymore. That's the kind of policy shift we would need. We would also, of course, need policy shifts which discourage corporate takeover of agriculture and the grabbing of farming land and forest land and so on in the name of industrialization and development, because we are losing huge amounts of lands for these sorts of purposes. And now the kind of policies and laws that the government is bringing in, including the three agriculture laws against which farmers have been agitating for many months, they are unfortunately trying to hand things over into the private corporate sector more and more. So policy is actually becoming more regressive. We need a different direction altogether, in which the maximum support is to the small farmer, is to the women farmer, and is also to independent farmer producer companies and cooperatives, which are able to bring many farmers together to create some kind of a critical mass for them to negotiate with the market and with the government. So if we have these sorts of things, we'll be able to outscale much more effectively, much faster, compared to what we have, the situation we have right now. Also, a third important factor would be consumer behavior. So people like us who, we eat food, we drink water and other drinks, we consume electricity, etc., etc. If we are able to support these small scale producers, for instance, directly tying up with organic farmers around us, near our city or wherever we're living, and creating consumer producer linkages, and advocating for farmers markets in our neighborhoods, etc. Or if we are able to support much more handmade production, handlooms, etc., rather than buying from big industries. So our own consumer behavior, changing consumer, what foods we eat, where we get them from, who we buy them from, who we support, those become very important parts of also the transformation. As millions of consumers changing their behavior would also cause quite a significant shift.
Right. I think this shift in behavior is one of the most essential points that we need to keep highlighting. However, in light of, capitalism's very deeply institutionalized character, I think it's sort of like a difficult collective challenge to, figure out a way out of this because these capitalistic values are very deeply entrenched in our society. So to just overcome that is a challenge for our generation, but I hope we can do that and contribute more to these local economies, especially the people from urban areas.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a number of things that can be done. I know it's a very difficult challenge, and I also know that it's very difficult because of the kind of advertising industry we have, which brainwashes us into thinking, into they tell us what's good for us rather than us trying to figure it out ourselves. And this happens right from childhood. No, children are targeted the most, and so we need to be able to tackle the advertising industry to become much more ethical in its practice. We need to be able to build these things into the education system, into the curricula. Just to give you an example, I think right from childhood, the lessons in schools and in schools or at home or whatever should also be telling us that if we are going to buy let's say a packet of chips, where does it come from, who's growing it, where does it go when we throw out the packet, what does it do to the environment, who is it affecting, benefiting, and who is losing out. If that kind of knowledge, that kind of information was provided to us whenever we buy something or consume something, as children, as young people, as adults, then at least for some of us it would probably make an impact and we might be more careful in what we are doing. I used to do an exercise in a nature club that I used to take in a school in Delhi many years back, in which we would look at what all has gone into the garbage bin, the waste paper bin in the classroom. We would kind of then look at it, we would analyze it, where does it come from, where is it going to end up. And it was quite remarkable because a lot of children would then ask questions, and then they would say, oh, maybe we should be more careful about consuming this, maybe we don't have to eat this particular kind of brand or whatever. So there would be some kind of different consciousness that gets raised. But it's these sorts of exercises that need to get built into the education system, into our homes, into any kind of creation of awareness anywhere. Even, for instance, in our transportation systems, if we take a bus or a train or a airplane, none of us really know the consequences of that travel, where we are going through, what kind of landscapes we are going through, what impacts we're having. All of this could actually be built into public education and learning systems, and it's not very expensive also, and it would create a massive impact.
Right. So there's definitely like a need for an overall reform of the current Indian education system and there's also a need for making it more inclusive and just teaching these students from a very young age about adopting these practices. Um, that sort of brings me to my last question to you. You have been working on the process of Vikalp Sangam for a while now. So, how do you think has Vikalp Sangam been aiding the process of localization, and what are the next steps that the collective is planning on adopting?
Well, the main reason we started the Vikalp Sangam process in 2017 was that we felt the need for a platform and a systematic, concerted attempt at trying to document and bring out the stories of transformation that are taking place across India. Because there was no such platform. We do have national level platforms for movements that are struggling against destructive development projects, such as the National Alliance for People's Movement. We have national networks on particular sectors, like for sustainable agriculture, there is ASHA. Now there is the National Coalition for natural farming, and others. But there was no cross-sectoral platform focusing predominantly on alternatives, and that's why Vikalp Sangam was created. And the reason we called it Vikalp Sangam and was that it's like a confluence, not a conference. It's not like a talk shop. It's an attempt to try and, as I said, bring together different movements, groups, individuals who are working on these sorts of issues, and to learn from each other across sectors. If you're working on sustainable agriculture, for instance, and I'm working on community health, how do we learn from each other so that my health programs build in safe food and your agriculture programs talk about the health benefits of organic food? So that, and then also bringing in issues of gender inequality, casteism, etc. The different kinds of inequalities and injustices that we have in India. So bringing all of these together with 4 or 5 objectives. One, sharing stories and learning from each other. Secondly, actively collaborating to take our work further with each other. Third, joint visioning of the kind of society we need, collective, if I might be bold enough to say, collective dreaming of the kind of India that we want. And then fourth would be strategizing on how we get there. And fifth would be advocacy for policy shifts of the kind that I've mentioned. We have been doing different kinds of activities. We've had physical confluences, about 20, 21 of them. Of course, in the last 1.5 years, it's not been possible, but till January 2020, we were doing these physical confluences, and we hope to have more coming up. In fact, next month, probably one in Ladakh. We have these confluences are either for particular states and geographies, or they are on particular themes like food, energy, democracy, etc. Then we've been doing a lot of documentation of stories. As I said earlier, we have about 1,600, 1,700 stories that are on the Vikalp Sangam website. Many commissioned by us, or written by us, but also many that are just picked up from wherever we can. Quite shamelessly, we just pick up from newspapers or magazines or other organizations and put them in, of course, with due credit, because we feel that we need a single source where lots of these positive stories of transformation are available. Also, a lot of filming, more than 100 short films are available now on these alternatives. We're beginning to do things like podcasts. In the last 1.5 years, we've also done many webinars where these people can bring out their own stories in a national or global to a national or global audience, especially stories of grassroots initiatives. So that's another program that's been happening. And then we've become quite active also on various media platforms, trying to do outreach of these stories. So more and more people get to know about them, they can support them, they can get inspired to try out their own things. There's a parallel, along in the Vikalp Sangam process, there is an ongoing youth Vikalp Sangam initiative, and they've done a number of confluences and other kinds of events. So I think that's very important, because young people in India and elsewhere need to really come up with their own perspectives, their own visions of the future, their own actions, their own changes in behavior, etc. So this is a process, I think, that also we hope that a lot more young people can get into, both in terms of resisting the current system, but also creating or supporting alternatives in various sectors in various parts of the country. And finally, Vikalp Sangam has also led to a global platform with similar initiatives in other parts of the world called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is with very similar objectives of trying to bring together movements and organizations and individuals working on radical alternatives all over the world. So that's it. It's very hard to say if we've been able to effectively shift things. It's maybe a bit too early. As we know, we're fighting against very powerful forces. But one of the things that has certainly happened is much more sharing and inspiration and collaboration, which has led to a number of newer or more stronger initiatives in different parts of India. I don't think so far we've been able to shift the macro picture, but and I don't think Vikalp Sangam on its own can do it also. We have to align with lots of other similar national and global networks and movements which we are doing. But we do hope that over the next few years that will also happen more and more.
Thank you so much, sir. This podcast has definitely been super insightful, and very interesting stories have come up about the various initiatives that you spoke about. And I really hope that we can drive the important lessons that from all of these initiatives and inculcate those in our work as well. Thank you so much for your time, sir. We at SPRF truly value it. See you next
Okay,
time.
thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Policy Room, produced by the Social and Political Research Foundation. SPRF is a youth oriented public policy think tank based in New Delhi, working to spark dialogues for a better democracy. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.